Israeli leader Benny Gantz says the murder of a Jewish American man in Los Angeles should serve as a stark warning sign to the whole world. 69-year-old Paul Kessler was attacked by a pro-Palestinian protester and later died of his injuries. On Twitter, or X, Gantz called on world leaders and the international community to be unequivocal and proactive in their condemnation of terror and anti-Semitism. Earlier this week, a Jewish woman in the city of Lyon in France was stabbed at her home by an assailant. The assailant is still at large. And a rabbi was murdered outside her home in Detroit. Her murderer also still at large. We want to talk more about soaring anti-Semitism. Daniel Pomerantz is the CEO of RealityCheck. He's a legal expert and political analyst. Avi Melamed is with us in the studio as well. So, Daniel, would you say that worldwide police and politicians are taking the threat to Jews seriously?
Not even remotely. And more disturbingly, I don't think Jewish communities are taking it seriously either. For decades now, there have been these marches that we call protests. They weren't protests. They were, at best, hate marches, at worst, attempts at the seeds of a pogrom. At these marches, and I experienced them myself when I used to live in America, they would shout things like, "Death to Jews," they would show Nazi swastikas, and they would scream about the Khaybar massacre, which was a massacre in the 7th century of Jews by Muslims, which included a great deal of going door to door, beheadings and rapings. And if that sounds familiar, it's not coincidence. The massacres of October 7th were intentionally modeled on the Khaybar massacre of the 7th century. We've reached a point where we can no longer hear people say, "This is what I intend to do," and then say to ourselves, "Oh, they don't really mean it," or "They won't carry it out." People are saying quite clearly and honestly what they intend to do to the Jewish people, and we've been ignoring it for decades. It's also worth pointing out that when you call for violence, that's called incitement. That's not protected by the First Amendment, and it's not legal. So the fact that these marches, these aren't protests, these are hate marches, these are incitements to violence, the fact that they're happening at all in countries where they are illegal is a sign that countries are not enforcing their own laws and that Jewish communities are not calling on their governments to enforce those laws.
Well, quite. I mean, both France and Germany have tried to ban these rallies, and they have gone ahead nonetheless. In the UK, they haven't been banned, but what is banned is open support for terrorist groups, and we have seen a range of images of people supporting Hamas, supporting Hizb ut-Tahrir, another terrorist group, and there is actually footage of British police officers telling people to put away their Union Jacks and England flags because they have openly said they cannot control such a large number of people. This is quite a dangerous situation for
Western countries. It's not true. They can. You know, it reminds me of Brown versus the Board of Education, when the Supreme Court of the United States decided that you can't prevent black students and white students from attending the same schools. When students turned out in Little Rock, Arkansas, the governor of Arkansas said, "We can't protect you, we cannot help you go into school." So what happened? The President of the United States sent in the U.S. military to make sure those students got to school. If the police can't do it, you send in the National Guard. If the National Guard can't do it, you send in the military. If the military can't do it, you send in NATO. But the moment you decide that your laws will be obeyed or not obeyed, just depending on how large and violent the group is the moment you have given up the sovereignty of your nation. And countries around the world, including the countries that claim to have banned these marches, are not taking the measures that they must take and are capable of taking to actually carry out their own laws.
As we've got, Jewish people in major Western cities saying that they're scared to leave their homes, they've taken down their mezuzahs, they won't send their children to school. Jewish schools have been closed. This month is Islamophobia Awareness Month. Interesting timing, wouldn't you say?
Well, racism exists in a lot of places in the world, and we should fight it every place in the world, and that includes Islamophobia. And if somebody sees fit to try and attack Muslims simply because they're Muslim, that is something we should fight against as well. But right now, at this particular moment, there is no community that is calling for the Khaybar massacre or the Nazi-style massacre of Muslims in any place in the world. That is something that is happening uniquely to Jews right now. And another thing that I find incredibly disturbing, more so even than this death is disturbing, but what I find even more disturbing is the Stars of David being painted on Jewish homes throughout Europe and in the United States. This isn't graffiti. This is not an expression of some. This is a call to action. People are saying this is a home where we want to bring a lynch mob later. We know this because they're saying so. This must be dealt with in the most serious possible way. Any area where we're seeing these painted must have 24-hour security, if not from the police, then from the military. That's how serious this is. It's how serious we should have been taking it 20 years ago, but we must take it seriously now.
Avi, I mean, what do you think about this? Do you think it's become normalized for, I mean, I lived in Europe for many years. You don't have any Jewish schools or synagogues or any Jewish institutions without armed police or private security outside. Do you think this has just become normalized and that people think, well, that's, if you're Jewish, that's how you have to live?
Look, what I think is we see today the bitter fruits of two combined processes that took place in the West for the last couple of decades. One is the slaughter of education. Education was slaughtered for the sake of narratives and sound bites and nice slogans and nice concepts and nice theories. You got a concept or a mindset in the West that was evolving, particularly in intellectual circles, not only there, what I call the knight and the dragon. Meaning people are looking for some kind of like a terrible dragon. They identify Israel as the terrible dragon. They are basically suffocated with idea of like, I'm a knight, I'm fighting for freedom. And from here, the way is very short to see the terrible thing that we see today when people in the West are basically supporting murderers of babies and rapists of their mothers because they view them as a freedom fighter. So this is one outcome of this toxic process that happened. And the other thing that is very disturbing, and I think it was alluded here, we have to think about the growing number of Muslims and Arabs who are in Europe and in the West. Most of them are people that in the end of the day are trying to be part of that society, but there are significant segments of that population that is totally don't see themselves as part of the hosting state. They are totally alienated. And this is the time where they have the opportunity to come and to spread their toxic, hateful rhetoric. Remember, there is a lot of evidence about Islamic preachers in the West who are preaching openly for hating, for crimes, for whatever, against the hosting states and against the Jews in particular. We are looking at a combination of these two terrible toxic processes that happens in the West in the last couple of decades. The West has to wake up.
The answer is communication. The Jews, we tend to think of themselves as a small community without a big voice. We work behind the scenes. We have to speak up just as if we were a large community. We have to find our friends and allies. We have to, organizations like mine, RealityCheck, we work on framing and messaging. This is what gets our governments to take the proper action once they understand what they're facing. But in order to do this, we have to speak up, speak up, speak up, and not stop. Every time an event like this happens, local police departments should be flooded with police reports, and local elected officials should be flooded with requests to take action.
Well, it's great work you do, and reassuring, I believe, for lots of Jews living around the world dealing with a terrible time right now. Thank you very much.